We're taking you deep into the complicated world of your food supply. Whether it's a steak, salad, or slice of bread, there's a lot happening in the process of getting what you eat to your table, and you should know about it. Who owns the farmland? Who is growing your food? Do we have a secure food supply? Is our food safe? And are we stewarding the land and animals well in the process? In this 5-part series, we're pulling back the curtain and answering those questions. I'm Rita Rogers.
And I'm Cecily Dickey. This is the Boom Clap podcast where culture and conviction collide.
Today we talk to Bill Bullard, the CEO of RCAF USA, the largest producer-only membership-based organization that exclusively represents U.S. cattle and sheep producers on a domestic and international trade and marketing issues. We also talk to Rich Brazil, a longtime large animal veterinarian. We cover what's in your food. Is it safe? Is the information even available to you for you to make that determination? And as for the information that is available to you, is it accurate or is it deceptive? Bill gives us an excellent insight into meat imports, labeling, the consolidation of meat production in America, and the dangers of it. Rich explains the shady nature of the green agenda as applied to ranching and tapping into the potential of ulterior motives. We know people also have concerns about mRNA vaccine usage in meat animals that they'll eventually consume. So we'll cover this in a way that allows you to be the decision maker on that.
I'm so excited that I get to share with you about ARC Seed Kits. This company provides seed kits with a 15-year shelf life so that you can secure your family's food supply for years to come. ARC Seed Kits fit the bill for this podcast series perfectly. We wanted to make our listeners aware of some of the challenges facing farmers, some of the problems in agriculture, and how you can best choose to eat and make sure that your family is protected in case of issues with food supply. ARC Seed Kits are made up of heirloom seeds so that they will be able to reproduce, unlike the popular and widespread hybrid seeds that you might see often. If you can save seeds, you have a secure food supply. The all-in-one kit from ARC is a great place to start. It offers 50,000 seeds from different varieties, and the family behind ARC Seed Kits has carefully selected nutrient and calorie-dense vegetables and fruits to sustain any home at any time. They've also included a seed guide to give the owner the knowledge and information to grow and harvest every variety that ARC has to offer. Trust me, as someone who spends hundreds of dollars on seeds every year, this is what I will now exclusively be using. This is absolutely the most economical way to secure your own food supply. Go to arcseedkits.com or click the link in our show notes and enter the code BOOMCLAP to save a further 10% on your order.
So Cecily, before we get into this episode, I don't know, we have a lot of thoughts on vaccines, and I know you guys all do too. It seems to be a very polarizing topic, and people are firmly planted on either side in most cases. So as you listen here, I want you to understand that these two people we talked to, so first off, we talked to Bill, we interviewed him. And then in doing some more research before we talked to Rich, I found an article where RCAF was quoted. A veterinarian that represents RCAF was quoted talking about the mRNA vaccine. So I reached out to Bill again and asked him, do you have thoughts on this? And he said, I sure do. I sent you an article that I wrote for a magazine that decided they were not going to print the article. So at the end, Cecily is going to read that article to you. But we talked to Bill, we talked to Rich, both about mRNA vaccines, and they both have different perspectives, I think. Would you agree, Cecily?
I think I would agree with that, yeah.
But at the same time, neither one of them's telling you what to think. They're both saying we need more information and we're letting you decide, essentially. So I would love for you guys to just stick around through that conversation on vaccines with Rich and listen to Bill as well through Cecily's voice here. So
yeah, and if you guys want to know more about how how Rita and I kind of responded to COVID on the podcast and the issue of vaccinations and mandates and all of that, you can go through our old episodes, and we have quite a few that go through that, and you can really get a sense for where we land on that if you're new to the podcast. So do search for those, and stick around to the end of the episode so that you can hear Bill's thoughts on this issue of mRNA vaccines in cattle. So we have with us Bill Bullard. Do I say that right? Bill
Yes.
Bullard? Okay. It's one of those ones that I wasn't quite sure about. And I would love for you to tell us a bit about yourself and the organization that you're working with.
Okay. Well, I represent RCAF USA, which is a national nonprofit trade association that represents cattle farmers and ranchers and sheep producers. So we're distinguished because we represent only the farmers and ranchers. We don't represent the meat packers and distributors and the retailers that are all a part of the beef supply chain or the lamb supply chain. So, and we are the largest association that exclusively represents producers in the United States. We have about 4,000 members in 43 states, and we represent them on issues involving their profitability, marketing, as well as private property rights issues and trade issues. So we're looking at the issues that affect the viability of our nation's independent cattle farmers and ranchers and sheep producers.
Well, that's amazing. Like something that we've known, but are really learning even more and more as we've dug deep into this series is that we're losing farmers, we're losing ranchers. And so obviously an organization like RCAF is so vitally important because of the fact that you are advocating for the very people that we actually need the most in order to keep people fed, right? It's so important.
There's no question about it. This is a national food security when over the past 40 years, we've lost more than 5 out of every 10 cattle producers in the United States. We've lost more than 9 out of every hog producers out of every 10. We've lost nearly 9 out of every 10 dairy producers. And we've lost about 62% of our commercial sheep producers. Those are the sheep producers that have a flock size of over 100 head. So as we centralize and skeletonize the industry, we make vulnerable our national food security interests. And we saw that relatively recently, particularly during the COVID pandemic.
Yeah, I think that's where people's interest started coming in, right? People realize, hey, we go to the grocery store and pick up some food, but we have no idea what happens in the process of getting it to the store.
Right.
And suddenly it's not there. And so now we need to be thinking about this. I think that's on a lot of people's minds.
Well, and it's important to note that the reason people didn't care a lot about it is because it was a given that we had widely dispersed cattle farms and ranches and sheep farms and ranches all across the United States. They were disaggregated. We had local and regional meat packing plants that would serve rural communities and communities outside of the big city areas. And over the past, over a generation, we centralized the industry. We consolidated the industry. It is highly concentrated now. If you look at the cattle industry, for example, there are 4 meat packers that control 85% of the fed cattle that are produced for beef in the United States. That's an unprecedented level of concentration. And it's again, it was by design. It has been the multinational meat packers that have reshaped the framework within which our industry operates, and the policies that they have supported and passed have benefited their shareholders at the expense of the producers on the farms and ranches and every consumer in the United States of America.
Yeah. When you think of these big meat packing plants, so it goes from start to finish, right? A lot of these meat packing plants, where
so what you're talking about
owned.
Yes. So if we go back a little over a generation, we had just under 1,500 federally inspected beef packing plants in the United States. And we've wiped out 54% of them. Over half of them are gone today. And we've allowed the industry to go through what even the U.S. Department of Agriculture coined as merger mania. And that was during the 80s and early 90s. And we've allowed the multinational meat packers to essentially acquire and merge with all of the smaller packers. And they closed packing plants and they moved them all down to what we call the beef belt down in the south central United States. And as a result of the meat packing industry moving in that direction, our nation's feedlots migrated in close proximity to the feedlots. And so now we have most of the beef produced down in a single area in the United States. And of course, anytime you concentrate an industry like that, it is vulnerable to climatic conditions, to disease-related conditions, or any other kind of economic shock that would disrupt the supply chains. And that's what we've seen. And we have to reverse the process. We've got to turn this train around because this is not good for America.
Well, that's what so many people don't see. Like Rita and I, we actually both come from a nursing background. That's what we did in our previous lives, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. My particular area that I worked in was home health. And we went through a period where everything was centralized. Despite the fact that we all lived in very different geographical regions within the same province, yes, and health authority, but it was different. You know, some was super urban, some was very rural. This centralization was a disaster. And I was in my early 20s then, and it was kind of like the first time that I realized centralization is very bad. It's the first time I had ever thought about that. And what I've noticed throughout the years is that every time I've come upon centralization, it has been bad. And we sent each other a video this morning of you talking about avian influenza and how this really highlights the problem with centralization, particularly in agriculture. Can you talk about that a little bit? With those examples you used, was excellent.
So if we go back a century and Congress recognized that we had a capitalistic system and a free market system, but in order for that to function properly, there had to be rules. And so we passed back in 1890 the Sherman Antitrust Act. Soon thereafter, we passed the Clayton Antitrust Act. And these were designs to prevent that type of centralization, designed to prevent the monopolization of an industry, and designed to ensure that we had robust competition. And it would be competition that would determine winners and losers, not corporate boardrooms that would do so. But we went through a long period in the United States in which we decided that competition really wasn't the primary objective. What we needed to focus on was efficiency. And so long as the merging companies could show that they were creating efficiencies in the marketplace, Congress would look the other direction, our judicial system looked the other direction. And in essence, we allowed dust to collect on our antitrust laws and didn't enforce them. And so we've allowed the industry to be shaped by multinational corporations. And for the benefit of their shareholders, they found that they can be far more efficient with a largeness of scale and by reducing the number of participants in an industry and essentially skeletonizing it. And so this is a boom for the corporate shareholders. But again, at the expense of consumers and producers. And so we get to the bird flu. The bird flu has been affecting poultry operations over the past 3 years. You know, we've actually euthanized well over 60 million chickens as a result of this disease. So you've got concentrated poultry farms, and they're industrialized farms, and they get struck with a disease, and you literally have to wipe out millions of birds. As a result of that, you reduce the number of chickens, number of eggs that are in the supply chain, and you have difficulty in trying to contain a disease like this because you have so skeletonized the system. And that has put our nation at risk. And now the bird flu has jumped species. It's now gone from poultry to dairy cows. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture is currently scrambling, trying to contain this disease. They just implemented movement restrictions because the first objective is to contain the disease where they can. And but the fact of the matter is you are inherently more vulnerable to shocks like this in a highly concentrated, centralized system that we have today. And so in a disaggregated system where you had lots of small farms and ranches, you could contain a disease outbreak as we have in the past and limit it to whatever area it was first affected. And then we do not see the disruption in the food supply because there are so many scattered so broadly across the nation.
Well, it just makes sense, right? It just makes sense. And unfortunately, we've gotten ourselves really far down a road. So it's hard to find our way back to what actually makes sense.
That's right.
When I think about the fact that this avian influenza has like jumped its way over into cattle, I mean, it's devastating as it is with birds, but then we think of like how much smaller birds are, how much easier they are to reproduce, how many more you can have. When it jumps to cattle, and if it gets out of control in the way that it could with everything being so centralized, that's devastating just on so many levels because, you know, a cow produces one calf and they're pregnant for 10 months? I'm not sure.
9 months. 9 months, just like a human. Yes.
Okay. Anyway, so it takes a lot longer to reproduce cattle than it does chicken. And the consequences to food supply could be even more devastating because of that.
So if you look at how long it takes to rebuild a herd that has been liquidated, and we've gone through periods of liquidation as a result of widespread drought. We did so back in 2011 to 2013. And did so again in 2000 and late 20 and 21 and 22. And it takes actually 3 years to begin rebuilding the herd because of the long biological cycle, as you indicated, for cattle. So not only do you have the gestation period of 9 months, but it actually takes 15 to 18 months to actually raise the calf to breeding age or for harvesting, for slaughter. Yeah. And so we are unable to respond to supply shocks that could very well occur in a disease situation like this. Or if we're talking about not being vigilant in maintaining strong import controls, and we were to import a foreign animal disease like foot and mouth disease, our industry is vulnerable to those types of failed policy decisions of the past. And this is an issue that consumers should be concerned about. And again, they never had to worry about it when we had over 1 million disaggregated cattle producers all across the United States. And that was just a little over a generation ago in 1980.
Yeah, well, you say they never had to worry about it. You know, they didn't have to think about it. That's something you mentioned earlier in that episode as well. And something we really want to convey in this series is that food and how you get it and the quality of it is something that you need to think about it, because without it, you don't live.
That's right.
So it's something we want to help our listeners to understand. And for those that already do, we're hoping they'll share it with people around them, because this is one of the most important messages that needs to get out. Like, as far as very practical matters, there's nothing much that matters more than food. So I appreciate the work that you're doing. You had talked about imports as well. Obviously, that's a huge thing. So that's something we'd love you to talk about. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Rita, but we want to talk about labeling as well. And I know that all goes together. Do you have anything to add?
I just wanted to highlight really quick the staggering numbers that you laid out of the decrease in farms over a short period of time. It hasn't been that long, you know, that we have really decreased the amount of farms and moved it to this skeleton crew, as you called it. I think that's the best way to put it. It's a very good visualization. And when I was listening to you, I don't know if it was one of your videos or something, you were talking about vertical integration. And I was taken back to my teen years, and people are going to laugh. I'm just going to go ahead and say it. But I was pork queen one year at our county fair.
Sorry, and did you say pork queen?
Yep. Sure did. And
wow, you guys do things different down there in the USA.
But it was, you know, we had to give a speech to win. And my speech was about the dangers of vertical integration. And this was back in the 90s.
Good for
you. Mid 90s. And talking about how it was going to harm farming for small farmers. And I had not thought about that. I mean, in the last 25 years. And you brought that to mind for me. And I'm like, wow. It really has.
Queen knew what she was talking about, hey?
It really has had an impact.
Yes.
I don't know.
So there's been two significant dangers to our food supply. The first was globalization, and the second is concentration, and they work together. So globalization occurred first in a big way for the United States in the mid-90s. And what happened there was the multinational meat packers, they coveted cheaper supplies from wherever they could get it. And so the goal was to enter free trade agreements anywhere in the world where cattle could be produced and allow the multinational meat packers to buy their beef cheaper and then sell it to unsuspecting consumers in the United States as if it were produced under the United States food safety regime, which it isn't. The meat produced in foreign countries do not have to meet the same production standard while the animal is being raised for 15 to 18 months before it's harvested. And so we have slowly but consistently increased the percentage of imported beef in our U.S. market to where it's today about 20% of all the beef available in the U.S. market is imported. And consumers can't even choose to support the American family farm and ranch system of agriculture, by buying their products. Of course, that is how consumers can exercise choice in a marketplace and have a huge impact on the nation's food security. But Congress has seen fit not to allow country of origin labels on beef. And so consumer goes to the grocery store and sees beef at the counter, and that beef could be produced in Uruguay, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Mexico, any one of the 20 different countries that we import beef from. But the consumer doesn't know that. And so the consumer is currently not allowed to exercise choice in the marketplace. And that means competition can't occur where it should be occurring at the retail level. And so one of the big issues that we are supporting here is the restoration of mandatory country of origin labeling for beef, so consumers can begin to take control over their own destiny by supporting the United States family farm system of agriculture. And what's happening, and it's even worse than that, because right now a consumer can go to the grocery store and see a beef labeled as product of the USA. And that does not mean the beef was produced in the United States of America. It could well have been a beef produced in Uruguay, sent to the United States in a package. And all that is required right now under the U.S. Department of Agriculture rules is for that product to be brought into a U.S. processing plant. And there the old wrapper can be taken off and a new wrapper can be affixed to that Uruguayan beef product, and they can proudly present the product of the USA label on the product. So consumers have been deceived for years as a result of this, for lack of a better word, stupid policy that is detrimental to consumers. And that's why we're trying to bring it back. And if we look at the sheep industry, for example, where I said in the United States, approximately 20% of all the beef is actually from imported beef products or live cattle that are imported in the United States and converted to beef. If you look at the sheep industry, a year ago in 2022, 74% of all the lamb and mutton consumed in America was sourced from foreign countries, was sourced in Australia or New Zealand primarily. And what has happened is we have devastated and destroyed the commercial sheep industry in the United States. We have now become dependent on foreign sources for our food. And now we're jumping outside of the realm of national food security. Now we're in the realm of national security. If we have been so stupid as to lose our ability to continue producing the vast majority of the food we eat, then our nation is vulnerable. And the other issue, so that's globalization, that we have allowed the packers to essentially pick and choose where they want to source their product and sell it to unsuspecting consumers without disclosing the actual origins of the product. And the other problem is that concentration. And we've seen it first in the poultry industry, and then now it's moved to the hog industry. And that's the vertical integration. That's where the meat packer owns the entire supply chain, from birth to plate for our hogs and from egg to plate for chicken, for example. And the important thing that you know about vertical integration is it kills competition. So no longer in a vertically integrated system that is controlled by the corporations, it is no longer concentration that's determining where the product is produced, how much is produced, who produces it. Now it's a corporate boardroom decision. And as a result of that, we have purged competition from those poultry and hog industries. And from the corporate boardroom's perspective, they didn't want that many of those pesky farmers out there that they had to deal with. And that's why we wiped out 9 out of every 10 hog farmers just in the past 40 years. And why we've lost now over 5 of every 10 cattle producers. And when I say cattle producers, I mean cattle ranches, where they're actually producing. We've also lost 8 million mother cows out of our factory. We are fast becoming dependent on foreign countries for something that's just vital to our sustainability and strength, and that is our food system.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what I hear from you is obviously it's deceptive marketing, but it also just sounds to me like fake capitalism. Like the United States is supposed to be the number one, like, most capitalist country in the world, and this is fake capitalism.
Absolutely.
And it always blows my mind that a country as wealthy as United States or I'm Canadian, so that's why I reference Canada now and then. Wealthy as we are, we choose to be dependent on other countries that are perhaps from our Western perspective not as trustworthy as our countries would be. We choose to be dependent on them for the things that literally help us survive. Why do you think that is? I don't know if that's a fair question, but
well, it certainly is. And it is the problem. And so the decisions made to allow for this centralization and consolidation and globalization were made at the world level. It was made in Geneva. We have the World Trade Organization that is encouraging countries to forget about where a product is made. And instead, in fact, they had their own label. It was a product of the world. They did not want consumers to be able to choose to support their domestic supply chains or domestic industries. Instead, they wanted to grant to the country that has a comparative advantage in a particular product. So countries, for example, like in South America, in Brazil and Argentina, that can raise a lot of cattle, year-round green grass. And they would have a comparative advantage in production of beef. And so the spoils, according to the global elites, should go to Brazil and Argentina. And then countries like the United States that do not have that comparative advantage would have to compete on other levels, quality, for example. And we've done that superbly well. The problem has been the quality can't overcome the lower prices experienced elsewhere. And so we start to dismantle our production systems in the United States as a result of this entire process. And so what we have done wrong is we have tried to follow the leader, and the leaders have been the global elites that are trying to establish these world international tribunals and essentially issuing edicts to countries like the United States. And a good example for this is right now, the government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, has just promulgated a final rule that says that U.S. cattle producers will now have to affix a radio frequency identification ear tag if they want to ship adult cattle across state lines. Now, we have been fighting this because we value the independence and freedoms and liberties that our independent cattle producers have in the United States. And now you have the government mandating a certain type of technology that happens to be the most expensive technology out there. But now they must comply if they want to be involved in the cattle industry. This didn't start in the United States. This started at the World Organization for Animal Health. It started back in the mid-2000s. And the United States is just dutifully following the recommendations of these global elites. And it's all about control. And if it isn't about control, the effect that we've experienced certainly is leading to less control on the part of the independent producers and a great degree of control on the part of the global elites and the governments. We're headed in the wrong direction again, and we need to reverse this entire process.
Wow. So I guess you kind of answered this here, so maybe it's redundant to ask again. But do you think, like with the labeling legislation and things that you're trying to get through, do you think that legislators just don't understand? Or I guess, why is that hard to get pushed through? They just want to go along with the globalization? Like, what is the pull away from that?
Well, the representatives of globalization domestically would be the multinational meat packers who have been shaping policy at the global level and getting countries like the United States to follow them. And so the reason that Congress is adverse to restoring mandatory country of origin labeling is because the multinational meat packers don't want it. And they have been extremely effective in infiltrating the conventional cattle associations and other commodity groups to encourage them to carry their water for them. And they've been highly effective. And in fact, that's why we exist. That's why RCAF USA was formed, is because we clearly recognized that the meat packers had infiltrated the entire supply chain, and no longer did the independent farmer and rancher have a voice in America. So we were formed over 2 decades ago to provide that voice. And we've been fighting those conventional organizations and the meat packers that are calling, that are giving them their marching orders ever since. But that's why Congress, for example, Congress right now quivers in its boots as a result of a World Trade Organization ruling that determined that the United States should not provide its consumers with information as to the true origins of the food that they buy, in particular beef and pork. And it's a result of that World Trade Organization ruling that certainly is comprised of people who are unelected and unappointed. They're not accountable to the United States. And they effectively overturned a constitutionally passed law. Our country of origin labeling law has been challenged by the meatpacking industry and by their conventional organizations as to its constitutionality. And our district court, or the appellate court in the District of Columbia, has found that the country of origin labeling was in fact constitutional, and that the U.S. Department of Agriculture had the authority to do so. And so now we have a huge conflict. And who do you want to follow? Do we follow the unelected, unappointed international tribunal, who we know does not want consumers to know where their beef came from? Or do we do what the people want? And all the polls and surveys that have been conducted show an overwhelming support on the part of U.S. consumers to know the origins of their food.
Well, I mean, I think even of just like if you pick up any sort of, say you buy a bag of chips in the grocery store, you turn it over and you look at the ingredient label, right? Like if every single ingredient has to be listed, but it's for some reason not okay to say, hey, this beef was actually grown in Brazil. You know, like if you're looking at beef, that's the main ingredient. It's good to know where it comes from, really. It's crazy how we can be so particular about some things, but then the biggest things is kind of like, well, let's just pretend that doesn't matter.
Right. And so it's the age-old adage, follow the money. If a multinational meat packer can source cattle and beef in Brazil for 30 to 50% less than what he can procure that product from in the United States, they will defend their right to bring that foreign product into the United States unlabeled. And they have another advantage, and that's because all the beef that is sold at U.S. retail will have a United States food inspection sticker on it. It will all be certified as safe by our U.S. Department of Agriculture. And that includes the foreign products. And so consumers would just, you would expect that they would rely upon a USA label on their beef and say, well, this must denote the origin of the product. What all it denotes is the fact that the product has, at least by paperwork, has met the food safety standards required in the United States for a finished product. And the meat packers have exploited that. They know that consumers believe all the beef that's being consumed in America is produced domestically. And as I said earlier, consistently, we are increasing the volume of foreign beef that the United States is becoming dependent on.
Yeah, well, I know our listeners would probably agree with me that I want to decide, not my government, what is safe. I mean, I've heard the word safe and effective many times before, and they don't exactly mean the exact same thing that I would say they mean, you know? Right. So anyway, go ahead, Cecily.
Oh, I was going to say, isn't it true also that, and maybe you did touch on this a little bit, but isn't it true that the USA used to have higher standards for quality? And then that was also changed to make room for these other countries to import their meat?
Right. So I mentioned that we entered this era of globalization back in the mid-90s. And in 1995, the United States joined the World Trade Organization. And when they did that, it's commonly known as the WTO. When the United States joined, the World Trade Organization told them that we want to facilitate imports into your country, into the United States. but your standards are too high. So in order to facilitate more imports into the United States, we need you to lower your standards. And that's exactly what our U.S. Department of Agriculture did. The first thing they did was they no longer required foreign meat packing plants to have food safety standards that were at least equal to that of the United States. Instead, they adopted a close enough standard that all their food safety systems have to be is equivalent to the United States. No longer do they have to be at least equal to. And then it became too burdensome for some countries to send inspectors to foreign meatpacking plants in order to visually determine whether they are meeting these close enough standards. And we used to have monthly inspections of foreign meatpacking plants around the world. Any foreign country wanted to ship beef to the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture did monthly inspections until after the WTO. Then they decided they would relax that standard and only have periodic inspections. And so that's what we have now. It could happen every 6 months, could happen every year, could be a paper type review. But these are two clear examples of where the United States purposefully and willfully lowered our food safety standards for no other reason but to comply and be compliant with the globalists at the World Trade Organization. And there's another example. We've had some very strict import restrictions on countries that have pernicious diseases. And countries with foot and mouth disease, for example, were banned from importing product to the United States, and mad cow disease, BSE. Well, the United States was told that this is too restrictive for some of these developed or developing countries to comply with. And so the United States began a process of what they call regionalization. They would carve out an area within a foreign country where a disease outbreak has occurred and declare the rest of the country free of the disease, whether it was or not, and would allow that country to continue to benefit from exporting product to the United States. And so there's a third example of how the United States has further relaxed the food safety standards that were intended for one purpose, and that was to protect the American consumer. And now they're receiving less protections, and they can thank the U.S. Department of Agriculture's kowtowing to these international tribunals.
You know, an analogy that came to my mind as you were discussing that was, imagine a young man asked a young woman to marry him, but he says, you know, I'd like you to marry me, but your standards are too high. And she goes, oh, no problem. Let me just lower those for you. You know, everyone would think, oh, you've lost your mind. You know, like, don't lower your standards. That's never the goal. At least it shouldn't be. And here we have an entire country lowering their standards. And really, there should be a challenge to others to actually, hey, raise your standards. The consumer wants great. So get there, you know?
Well, and a country that purports to be a world leader, that's what the United States should have done. We should have We should have helped these developed and developing countries to meet these higher standards so that consumers around the world would benefit from them. And instead, like you said, our response was, well, if the standards are too high for some of you, we will just lower them so we can continue to import more product, and we can continue to force the exodus of independent farmers and ranchers out of our industry. And that's what's happened.
I mean, it sounds like the education system too. Like there's so many parallels that we can draw.
Yes.
It's like we've chosen in all areas to just, standards too high. I guess we better lower it. But the standard was there for a reason. Like it was achievable.
Well, and that brings us back to what is it that should determine the future and the viability of an independent industry in a capitalistic economy like we have here? It's competition. And it's competition that breeds excellence. And it's competition that breeds high value. And so if you look at the poultry industry today, that is completely vertically integrated, controlled by the meat packers that we call integrators, their goal is not to produce the highest quality chicken. Their goal is to produce a consistent quality chicken product that will fit in a particular package and that consumers would buy. So in essence, they are pursuing probably the lowest standard that consumers would be willing to purchase. Now, break up that vertically integrated that has killed competition, break up that model, and have poultry producers scattered all across the United States, all of them competing to be the best poultry producer in the United States. And what you have is a higher quality, more healthy, more wholesome product. And that's the same with every industry, the pork industry, the beef industry, the lamb industry. And so the goal has to be, the problem is we are no longer valuing competition as the highest priority for the industry. We've adopted the efficiency objective, for example. And so we have to get back, we must restore competition. And that's why we support mandatory country of origin labeling, is because it gives the consumer the ability to initiate demand signals right at the grocery store. Because when a consumer has a choice between a Uruguayan beef product and the United States beef product, and if that consumer selects the United States beef product, then that disappearance, the inventory, has to be replaced. And so that consumer is sending a demand signal all the way through the multi-segmented beef supply chain, and it lands at the packer's desk. And the packer has one choice and one choice only in order to replenish the lost inventory because of the consumer selection. That choice is that packer has to go to a United States cattle farmer and rancher to buy an animal that was exclusively born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States. And that's how you build demand for the products of our independent producers in the United States. Country of origin labeling is the initiation point. It's the empowerment of consumers to restore and reignite competition in an industry, like I said earlier, where competition has been purged.
Yeah. And I mean, that's true capitalism, right? Not the fake capitalism that has taken over.
Okay. One other question on foreign meat products. Our domestically raised pork is also largely foreign owned, correct? I don't know if you can explain that at all.
Yes. So
I'm sure
this
you can.
was a part of ignoring the national food security issues involved in domestic food production when our Congress allowed China to become the largest pork producer in the world. Smithfield Farms is now owned by China, which of course is controlled by the Communist Party of China. And they're the largest pork producer in the United States of America. That has to be disconcerting to the American public. And if we look at the beef industry, so we have 4 packers controlling 85% of the fed cattle market, meaning the market for beef where the animals are produced exclusively for beef, so the fed cattle market. We have 2 of those 4 packers are Brazilian owned, JBS and Marfrig. So only half of the monoliths that control the beef industry are domestic.
Huge.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Hey, one thing I just thought of that I had forgot to write down, I wanted to ask you about, and I haven't had time to look into it very much, but I saw something being reported, maybe it was through Epic Times, I can't remember, but about the Bureau of Land Management coming in and like taking grazing away from cattle ranchers out west. I don't really know much about it, but maybe you can tell us a little bit.
We can trace the origins of this back to the international tribunals again. There was a long period of time when the United States wanted to populate the West, and they provided incentives for farmers and ranchers to lease federally managed lands in order to make it productive in raising sheep and cattle. And times had changed. And suddenly there was a reversal after we entered globalization. And the reversal was an effort to depopulate the West and to remove cattle and sheep from federally managed lands. And the Bureau of Land Management is a key player in this, the Forest Service. This has been a long-term effort, and we are essentially hollowing out rural communities all across the West in states and areas where there's a high percentage of these federally managed lands available. And as a result, we're seeing wildfires out of control like we've never seen before because we're no longer controlling the vegetation that is fueling these fires. In the sheep industry, for example, the sheep waste is actually a fire retardant. So not only do they remove the fuel, but they actually help to suppress a fire after it starts. And so this is just yet another example of the United States heading in the wrong direction because we've relied too heavily upon some international tribunal to determine our destiny here in the United States.
Well, that's interesting, right? Because people say cattle is like massive contributor to climate change, and then climate change is causing these fires. And the thing that people don't hear is stuff like you just said, how, these things were actually made to work in harmony together. That's how this planet was created. And meanwhile, the things that we're doing to try to mitigate the issues are actually compounding the issues. But people don't know that unless they're able to find someone like you to help them understand these things.
It would take a lot more fossil fuels and energy to produce fake meat, meat not from animals, and to sell it to consumers with a label that says this is a green product. Yeah. It is just extremely difficult to understand how one of God's creatures could be destroying the planet. And if it's true that cattle today, numbered in the tens of millions of head, are destroying the planet, these are because they're ruminant animals, they have 4 stomachs, then why, pray tell, didn't the buffalo destroy the planet back in the 1800s? Because we had tens of millions of buffalo that were grazing on the same land that cattle are grazing today. This is an argument that is politically motivated, and it's designed to put power in the hands of those who are seeking it and to take it away from producers. And the way you do that is you deprive producers of the right to own and control and manage their own property.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said, like, why would one of God's creatures be destroying the planet? I mean, there's only one creature of God's that I know that's destroying anything, right? And that's humanity. And the reason for that is traced back all the way to the Garden of Eden. It's certainly not the cows, but they're the ones that are taking the blame.
Well, it's because it's a low-hanging fruit. They're not going to attack the airline industry or any other economic segment that has busloads of lobbyists. They're going to take after the independent producer who doesn't have the resources with which to fight back as effectively as some of these other industries would. So that's why there's a focus on cows. It's because it's a low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. I was actually just reading while I was holding my son for nap time earlier. Some young guy in college I think Taylor Swift is trying to take him to court because he's been logging her private jet miles. And I can't remember how many times they said she could have flown around the earth just this year, but it was a lot. And this whole article was devoted to delineating the reasons why she's not the problem and celebrities flying isn't the problem, but we should point our efforts towards like just everybody driving a few miles slower and looking at the beef industry and all of these things. And I'm just like, who in their right mind can read this and think this is logical to, take our eye off of all these things that we're obviously doing as humans and look at, like you said, God's creatures. You said it so well. So anyway, you brought up something again about the beef in the supermarkets. And I want to ask one more question there. Pink slime is in the news some. And I think that our listener base has probably heard of that and heard that term and would like to know if that is a real thing, if it's really in supermarket beef. And also, I think people maybe have an idea that when they're going to the store, they're buying hamburger from one animal. Is that true?
So we'll start with the last question first. Is it true that the ground beef you buy at a grocery store comes from one animal? If you bought it from a local packing plant or a local locker, very likely it came from one animal, or if it was your beef that was cut up and fabricated. But if you buy beef at a grocery store, the answer is it's not likely to have come from one animal, and it could have come from an untold number of animals, because we Much of this ground beef is imported, very lean grinding product from Australia, New Zealand primarily. And it's brought into the United States, and it's mixed with the high quality trim that is derived from grain-fed animals, so essentially fat. And they mix these two together, and they mix them in big drums, and there could be an untold number of animals involved in that ground beef product. And now to the pink slime issue. So technology had provided a means by which to take more parcels of meat off of the skeletal system and to do it mechanically, automatically. And that's what this process involves, is taking more of the meat particles off of a skeleton than has ever been done before. And then it's mixed, and I don't know the process, but it's mixed to a constituency that folks have labeled as pink slime. And then that's mixed in with ground beef products as well. And so we have objected to this because of health concerns primarily, but it is a product that's being offered, and there was a huge lawsuit over a news service that coined the term pink slime or used it, and a settlement occurred, and none of us know exactly what that settlement was, but the industry won, and so we continue to have that product available to consumers today.
How prevalent would you say that is in, like, if you go to the store, is that in all of the ground beef that you're buying at the
All right, so to be clear,
store?
I'm going to speculate here because I do not know the answer to your question, but I doubt that it would be true that it's in most of the ground beef. I don't know for sure.
Okay. So would you tell consumers, I guess, two questions here to end up, because I know people are listening and they're going to be like, this is great information. What can we do? Okay. So how important is the consumer in changing the way legislation, I guess, goes for the beef industry? How important is the consumer demand? And what would you tell consumers to do to try to change things about the beef industry or sheep industry, any of those, pork industry?
So, number one, consumers should call their members of Congress and tell their members, I want to know the country where my beef was produced. Support. And we have two bills in Congress right now. The Senate version is the easy one. It's the American Beef Labeling Act. Consumers should call their members of Congress and direct them to co-sponsor the American Beef Labeling Act, so consumers can know where their beef comes from. The second thing is consumers should be calling Congress to say, we need to return to a family farm system of agriculture in the United States. We have to reverse this industrialized process of our food system, and we need to begin relying upon our own Congress. So the important thing in that mix is we need to restore and strengthen the American family farm system of agriculture. And they should direct their member of Congress to do just that.
Okay.
That's great. And just in closing, one more question. Is there anything else that you think is important for consumers to know about the labels they find on their agriculture food products? We've talked a lot about, obviously, country of origin, which is so important. But is there anything else that, the average person heading to the grocery store looking to buy some meat or dairy or anything else that you would want them to know?
Well, so it would be labels that would afford consumers a choice in the kind of beef they want. And some consumers may want a grass-fed beef product, an all-organic beef product, or an antibiotic-free beef product. And so those labels could be extremely important to provide that opportunity, in addition to the country where the animal was born, raised, and where it was slaughtered. And there's been problems with those labels as well. There's been problems as to what is the true definition of a grass-fed animal, because actually all calves are grass-fed while they're suckling on their mothers. And so are they making such claims there? So we, as a nation, we need to get a handle on truthful marketing. Because obviously we have turned that responsibility over to the multinational meat packers that have been labeling things the way that they want to label them at the expense of consumers. So I guess there is a third request to their member of Congress. Tell them to get the labels correct so that you can make informed choices for whatever reason you have when you're purchasing your protein for your families.
Yeah. So I think like what you're saying is right now, unfortunately, labeling is deceptive. But what we can do is petition members of Congress to pay attention and work towards making some changes. Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else, Rita, before?
I'm sure that there are other things that we should have asked you because you're a wealth of knowledge, but I'm just so thankful that you came on and were able to speak to us about food labeling and everything.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
So,
yeah.
Oh,
so please, remind people about RCAF, where to find you guys and the work that you're doing.
Our address is P.O. Box 30715, Billings, Montana. They can reach us on our website at r-calfusa.com. They can go to our Facebook page, and we're on platforms that I don't know how they work, Twitter and what have you. Or they can do it the old-fashioned way and call us at 406-252-2516.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay, people who care about what is in their food usually also care about what's in their cleaning products and what they're putting on their body, right? I mean, at least I do. I care about what's in all of it.
I do.
So, Rocasa, this is where Rocasa Organics comes in. Cecily and I have, over the last probably year, switched, I don't know, I'm speaking for myself here, have switched my entire home over to mostly Rocasa products for cleaning and for like lotions, soaps and things like that, because they're clean, good products. I know what's in them.
Yeah, their ingredients are so basic that you could like let your baby play with them and you could feel totally fine about it, except for the mess that might be created. They're just such clean products. Like, for example, I washed my robe the other day, like, you know, like your cozy robe that you wear when you get out of bed and whatever. And I washed it in their citrus and mint laundry detergent. And I just like wanted to keep my face buried in that thing the whole time. And I thought their bergamot and lavender was impossible to beat. And I still don't know if it's citrus and mint or bergamot and lavender, but they do such a good job with their products because these fragrances that I want to bury my face in are not artificial. That's all essential oils. And when it comes to false fragrance, that's first of all so bad for you. And if you don't use them for a long time, you become super reactive to them. So for me to be able to just enjoy the smell of like clean laundry that has a scent to it is like a big deal. I love it. So you guys definitely need to check out Rocasa. You can click the link in our show notes and use the code BOOMCLAP to get 20% off your first order.
I want to tell you about one of our sponsors, Barn to Door. So I have a baby and I wanted to feed him good quality beef and I wanted liver mixed in. Okay, this is the story. I was at a Christmas party and I brought this up. And what do you know? The gal I was talking to, small talk, I didn't know her yet. She grows and raises beef and they sell beef locally. And so she's like, here, just go to this website and you can purchase and then you can pick it up anytime. And it was powered by Barn to Door. And so I found meat for my baby and I found a great company to engage with that is doing great things for small farmers in our area and across the country. And digging in more, I was intrigued to learn that Barn to Door actually powers thousands of farmers across all 50 states. And they sell to more than 1 million people already, which is awesome. So if you're a farmer looking to improve your brand presence and make it easy for buyers to purchase from you, go to barntodoor.com to learn more. if you're a local buyer and you want to purchase from a local farmer like I did, you can go to localfarmfinder.com to discover farmers in your own community. We'll drop the links in our show notes and you can go there, or you can just go to the websites I just mentioned to engage with farm to door and local farmers in your area.
So tell us a bit about what you do as a veterinarian.
Yeah. So, just my background. I went to the University of California at Davis. I studied animal science, ag science and management, specializing in animal science. Went to Australia, studied for a year, came back, went to vet school at UC Davis. Graduated in '88, met my wife in vet school. She's a veterinarian also.
Wow.
We got married after vet school. We have 8 children. Wow. Yeah. Most of them are out of the house, but we still have 1 or 2 still around, one in college and then one freshman in high school.
Oh, that's awesome.
So I practice, since that time, I've practiced large animal medicine and surgery, mostly ambulatory. I drive around to different ranches, dealing with cattle, horses, sheep, goats, pigs, pretty much exclusively large animal. I do ranch dogs, a little bit to vaccinate or whatever. Also, I've been a ranch management consultant all during that time, just with my background and my interest in helping producers make a living. So I've done that as well. So, yeah.
Awesome. So just a personal question out of curiosity, of your 8 children, are any of them following in yours and your wife's footsteps as far as getting into
Well, so we have a son who's an emergency room doctor, ER doctor.
Okay.
We have a daughter who's a physical therapist, but really varied. We have another that's a biologist. We have another that's a writer, another that's a CPA, another who has a degree in biology, but he's restoring old cars. He's just really, really gifted at that, and he's crazy. I don't know, he didn't learn it from me, that's for sure, but that's what he does. And we have another who's an artist, who's a really good painter, and she's still in school. She's in college still, going to the Master's University down in Southern California. And then we have a girl in high school, but so far no vets. So
that's interesting. I thought maybe with a mom and a dad that are both a vet, there'd be, but it sounds like a lot of them were interested in biology in some way or another. So that's interesting. As Rita and I both have younger children than that. Obviously, my oldest is 12. My youngest is about to turn 9. And I find at this stage of life, it's cool to hear about other families and their growing children or grown children and like what they end up doing. Because for me, with my kids at their ages they are right now, it's fun to imagine like, we are starting to see their gifts and talents come out and imagine like what they could do. So it's cool to hear all of your multiple children and the different directions they went. That's pretty awesome. Yeah,
it's neat because they're all unique and different, and just to watch them blossom and see their interests and their strengths. And it's neat to see that unfold.
Very cool.
Yeah. Very cool. Well, speaking of your children, I think that's how I came across you. One of your daughters runs an Instagram account, which I don't know, she's really good at putting video and like clips of audio together to just make things interesting and she talks a lot about farming on there. I mean, that's not the sole focus of the account, but talks a lot about ranching and farming. And I think that's how I came across you, is she had a few videos. I didn't realize you were her dad at the time.
Yeah.
Or that was the relationship or how she came across you for the account. But there was a video of you talking about, I guess, for lack of a better word, cow farts. And how they're not the problem when it comes to the green movement. So we were like, man, this guy would be really good to talk to for this series, because a lot of what we're talking about with food supply, there's a lot that marries in with that green movement, because, I mean, they're moving towards trying to get rid of cattle ranching to some extent anyways. So there's a few things we want to touch on with you today, but first, when we were talking before the podcast on the phone, you spoke to me about UC Davis, where you went to college, and that they're moving to try to like genetically modify cattle to eliminate the methane. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, California wants to be, carbon neutral by 2030, excuse me, which is pretty close. One of the things they see as a big problem is cattle methane production. Cattle methane accounts for only about 3% of the carbon that cattle take in. 3% is returned as methane. And so they're trying to reduce that. They're hoping to reduce it to 2%. So to go from 3% to 2%. To do that is very, very challenging. They're approaching it from a multitude of directions. One is to try to genetically select for cattle that produce less methane. Secondly, they're trying to alter the rumen biome to try and alter the microflora of the rumen, which is where the fermentation takes place, where the methane is produced, which is why cows don't fart, because that comes out the front, not the back. Cows don't fart. They can in very unusual situations, but they don't. So that's crazy. So they're trying to reduce that methane production by 1%, from 3% down to 2%. And the rumen biome is exceedingly complicated. There's well over 2,000 different types of organisms, bacteria, protozoa, that are involved, which we, after 50, 60 years of studying this, we are just scratching the surface in our understanding. So to try and alter that is, it's really moving heaven and earth. They're talking about using different things like different seaweed supplements that might decrease the methane production. But the rumen flora acclimates and changes. And so they're not, confident that if they make a feed supplement change that it will stick, that the rumen flora won't acclimate and continue to produce as much methane. So it's very, very difficult, very complicated. But yeah, one of the things is also trying to select for decreased methane production, because of the idea that cattle methane production is a significant environmental problem, which I don't believe it is. But that's the effort, is to reduce the carbon methane production from 3% down to 2%.
So not genetically modify, genetically select. They're using selection.
Genetically.
Which is different.
Primarily. Yes. Right. Yes. No, that's correct. So not gene splicing necessarily. But trying to develop cows mostly through natural processes, but really everything is open, because this is seen as an existential threat. So, they're trying everything in the book to decrease the methane production in cows.
Yeah.
But one of the things about cattle methane production is that methane doesn't last in the environment very long.
Yeah.
So within about 30 years, it has a short half-life. Within about 30, 32 years, it's completely eliminated. So the methane that's produced from cattle is at a steady state. The number of cattle aren't increasing. So it's kind of like pouring water into a barrel with a hole in the bottom, a hole in the side. At some point, you reach equilibrium where, it's the same amount going in is the same amount coming out. And so we're at that point. Cattle aren't increasing the methane because the methane that they have produced in the past is being broken down just as fast as the new methane is being produced.
Okay. So interesting. And another thing that I heard about just last week, actually, we had some people over and they were talking about how they had heard that they're using bags, and they said they put it on like the cow's back end to collect their gas. So I'm guessing that's wrong based on what you said. They don't actually fart. Yeah. So
they probably, they probably have a ruminotomy cannula. So they have a window into the rumen. So as the CO2 and methane are being produced, it's coming out the side rather than being belched out or eructated out, orally. So it's collected and measured. Yeah. So that's just part of the testing.
So there's a picture of a cow there with a backpack that's collecting methane. Interesting.
Yeah. So it's probably coming from the left side, high on the left side where the rumen is.
So would they have actually gone in through the cow's side to put really?
they'd have to surgically prepare the cow.
It's pretty invasive.
Yeah. Yeah. So the cow has a window from the rumen to the outside, and that's going up into the bag, I would imagine.
Wow.
Yeah.
But
because it's not coming out the back. The cows don't fart.
Your friends that were doing this, like they're doing this to collect for study, or they think they're doing it to like help with a problem?
It was just like a homeschooling family friend, and they had heard about it like in their studies, and they were telling us about this.
Gotcha.
So they were a little bit wrong on the details there, but I guess that is something that people are trying to do, but that seems super invasive to the animal.
Yeah, well, this would be a research situation. So like at UC Davis, they do this type of thing where they are trying to monitor and see what maybe changes the methane production, and what dietary supplements, how they can manipulate the rumen biome to change the methane production. And so this is one of the ways that they measure it.
Gotcha.
They can keep track of it. But it's in a laboratory research type situation.
Right. It's not like everywhere.
No. And so it would require surgery to prepare a cow for that.
So one thing that triggers like a little alarm bells in my mind is like, we know now, thankfully more people are becoming aware of how important the gut biome is just in a person's health. Same is true for animals as well. So when I think of the rumen, or the gut biome, I should say, of a cow being altered on purpose, I'm like, oh, you're taking something that was created a specific way for a specific purpose, and now changing that in order to try to meet some man-made goal seems very questionable to me.
Yeah, what could go wrong, right?
Yeah, what could go wrong?
Yeah. No, that's just it. That's always the situation. These things are much more complicated than we might think. So there are effects, and there definitely can be unintended consequences. So it's something that would require a lot of research to make sure, hey, what alterations are happening besides what we intend. So yeah, definitely, it's a monumental undertaking. It really is. And good luck with that. Good luck at redesigning the cow.
Right. Yeah. Just quickly do that a minute here.
That's a quote. Good luck at redesigning the cow.
That's funny. Interesting. Okay. Now, one other thing that I read when I was looking up these cow backpacks, and then I'll get off the backpack train, I promise, is that apparently a cow will produce 25% less methane if it's fully like grass fed rather than supplemented with grain at all. Does that sound right to you?
I'm not sure. I couldn't speak to that. Yeah. I'm not sure exactly what feeding alters that. But, it's so interesting because methane is being produced because bacteria in the rumen are degrading the cellulose and the organic matter of the feed stuff, right? The bacteria are producing it. So whether it's produced by the bacteria in the rumen or whether it's produced by bacteria outside of the rumen, it's the same situation. So plant material that's produced through photosynthesis, eventually, if it's not consumed, it's broken down by bacteria to produce methane and CO2. So, a lot of this is very myopic and not really seeing the big picture, the big situation. So
I would agree. And it's just, I don't know. It's just like, what is it really a problem? Like, that's the question. Like, is it really a problem in the first place? I think we had a conversation with Bill Bullard that's on this episode as well. And he's like, I find it hard to believe that a cow, one of God's creatures that he created, is destroying the earth. Like, that's pretty hard to believe. And to your point, Cecily, about grass-fed or grain-fed, I mean, you get into longevity of the animal as well. Well, if it produces 25% less methane because it's being fed grass, but it's being fed for that much longer before it goes to slaughter, that sort of offsets as well. So
true. And another thing I was thinking about that just simplistically is like, cows have 4 stomachs because they're meant to digest grasses, right? And so if they're then eating grain, they're probably going to produce more methane just because it's not something that they were naturally built to consume, I think, right? Based on the anatomy. I don't know, like, and I think of people, like certain people have intolerances to certain types of food, and then they also create more methane, you know, like if you're not actually made to digest what you're trying to digest. So I don't know, there's a couple different ways to look at it. But like you said, the question is it actually the problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's a very valid question. You know, I mean, we were supposed to be dead a long time ago from a lot of these things back in the early 2000s. Even, you know, I first heard about this in like the 1980s, early 1980s. That was right after, of course, we were going into a new ice age.
Global cooling. Yes.
So, yeah. So, you know, a lot of ideas about how the sky is falling, and it hasn't really fallen yet that we can measure. So I think there's a lot of question about that. And then it makes you question the motivations for people who so strongly push these ideas.
Absolutely. I agree. Yeah. It's kind of, we're just playing God here with all these different methods of trying to fix everything that's actually probably creating more problems. So
yes.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Well, and just back to your point about cows being a problem. I mean, cows, ruminant digestion is really indistinguishable between cattle and bison and deer and elk and gazelle and, you know, all these other ruminants. It's the same thing. So to eliminate all the grazing animals to somehow fix the planet doesn't make any sense when the planet has existed for a long time with these grazing animals. They very much are missing a big part of the equation, which is the amount of carbon that's removed from the carbon cycle by grazing ruminants. So like I say, 3% is returned to the carbon cycle as methane. But what about that other 97%? And much of that is taken out of the carbon cycle, which is one of the few things that actually removes carbon from the carbon cycle. Cows don't produce carbon. They just simply recycle the carbon that's already in the cycle. And so some of it goes back, but also a large amount of it is removed from the carbon cycle through grazing livestock, either by being converted into meat and fiber, but also more importantly, being digested and returning into the soil through feces. The carbon that's in the fecal matter of cattle goes back into the soil. A large percentage of that, as much as 14% of the total taken in, sits in the environment in the soil as a soil carbon sink for decades to centuries. There's few other tools that we have that are that powerful. The average cow removes about 4 metric tons of CO2e, which is how they measure this, right? Carbon dioxide equivalents. Average cow, grazing cow, removes about 4 metric tons per year. And much of that is put into the soil as a long-term carbon sink. So are they really, creating the carbon problem? Are they just really a filter for the atmosphere and removing carbon from the carbon cycle? If we were to change the amount of soil carbon just 1 or 2%, it'd make a tremendous difference in the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere. Like I say, very myopic to look at the 3% and to not look at the 97% that's not returning to the carbon cycle.
Yeah. Which begs a question that you posed a little while ago. Is there an ulterior motive? And I will go ahead and say, yes, I do believe there is, because this is our podcast and I can say that, I think there is. And so we talk about these things and it might seem silly to even be discussing it if it's not really an issue. But there are so many people, I think, that really believe that this is an issue. They can maybe see some of the things going on in the world and see some of the ulterior motives. But when you talk about climate, people translate that to environment and they think that they should care about it. And I mean, we should care about the environment, but when we talk about climate, that's a separate thing. Environment and climate are not they're not the same conversation, at least as they're being had right now on a global scale. So when we talk about eliminating or abating farming or abating cattle, ranching, that gets into food supply and that gets into control. And I think there is an ulterior motive. So,
yeah. And, back to food supply, right? I mean, what could go wrong? when we start making changes, centrally directed changes in our food supply, we've had periods in our history of millions of people dying of starvation through that type of approach, right? Central command control approach to food management. So that's a very real thing. That should be a concern.
Yep. Great point. Great point. Okay, another thing we want to talk to you about is mRNA vaccines. This is something that there is a buzz about during COVID. I know if you are a new listener, I personally lost my job saying no to getting an mRNA vaccine. I was an ICU nurse for 15 years. And I know people are worried about this being posed as a solution to some issues with animals, introducing mRNA vaccines into our meat production animals. So I kind of wanted you to just talk through that. I don't really know what your take is, but I would like to hear your idea on that.
So that gets into a lot of things like just the question of immunity and vaccination, and then specifically this type of vaccine, a messenger RNA vaccine, for example, and how it works. And what are potential pitfalls and advantages that it can create. So just back to immunity, maybe briefly to kind of, go over a lot of biology, physiology, immunology, but, we are truly fearfully and wonderfully made, right? Our bodies are incredibly complex, almost infinitely more complex than any man-created designed apparatus, like say the space shuttle or whatever. Our bodies are very complicated. So we have been designed to have an immune system, which enables us to fight foreign intruders, which there are a lot here in the fallen world. There's, bacterial and viral pathogens that we can be infected with. Our body needs to be able to differentiate between self and foreign proteins, foreign intruders. And so, we have been, we've been given that. We have that. We have a very complicated defense system, a lot of redundancies to fight off infection, antibody immunity, cellular immunity, different types of cellular T killer cells, and all these other different types of approaches, kind of like a military, right? You got the Army, and you got the Navy, and you got the Air Force, you got hand grenades, and it's a very complicated, very complicated system that has a lot of redundancies to keep us healthy. When we get exposed to a foreign intruder, our immune cells then create a response against that. Sometimes it's the actual disease organism, the actual virus. And we survive the virus, hopefully. And from that point on, we have memory of that immunity. If we ever encounter that pathogen again, we can mount an immune response to fight it off. But you'd rather not have to live through the disease, right? Because sometimes you don't live through the disease, or there's lots of complications. But vaccination is a way to expose the immune system to the foreign intruder and to develop a response. And we've been doing that for, well over 200 years. I think since the mid 1700s, the first vaccines was simply controlled exposure to the pathogen. Started with smallpox. Actually, Jonathan Edwards, he died from an attempted smallpox vaccination. So that was in, 1758 or so. So we've been doing this a long time. So trying, in a controlled environment, under a doctor's care, when you're healthy, exposure to the pathogen, exposure to material from an infected person, and then hopefully you survive, and then you're protected. Later on, we started to use vaccines from things that were closely related. So, for example, for smallpox, the cowpox virus was very similar. People began to realize that those who had survived cowpox infections didn't get smallpox. And this is at a time that, about 1 out of every 10 people would die from smallpox or more, at minimum 1 out of every 10 people. So men, women, children would die from smallpox, about at least 10%. So they began to then take the material from infected cows and scrape it onto the skin of people for a very early vaccine, exposing them to the cowpox and protecting them later on from smallpox. And that was the vaccine for smallpox until the early 1900s, when modern immunology began to develop. At that point, we began to refine it a little bit by exposing the body to dead virus or dead bacterial products that would sensitize the immune system to this foreign intruder, and then the immune system would begin to develop an immune reaction to it. If it ever encountered that foreign intruder in the future, it would have memory of that, and the person wouldn't get sick and die. After that, we began to do what are called modified live vaccines, either for bacteria or for viral particles, to change the bacteria or change the virus so it doesn't actually cause disease, but it enables the body to be exposed to those surface antigens, those surface proteins that identify that pathogen as being non-self. So the immune system begins to fight against it. So that was, very helpful. A lot of our, vaccinations that we grew up with are from that type of approach, whether it's tetanus, whether it's rabies, lots of different vaccines are from that approach. In the 80s and 90s, we began to use what's called recombinant vaccinations. And so these were vaccines produced. At that point, we were able to read the DNA of these pathogens, and we were able to clip out, select for those the DNA code for those surface proteins, and then insert that into E. coli, for example, and grow that protein. And we would only grow that protein, and then we would inject the protein into the body as a recombinant protein vaccination. And then the body would mount an immune response to that. And if ever the person was exposed to that pathogen, they would be immune. So messenger RNA vaccines are kind of, another step. They're another potential tool in the toolbox to create vaccinations. They have a lot of advantages. They can be very quickly produced because now we can read the DNA code and we can make messenger RNA that is then injected into a person to create an immune response. And how that all works kind of gets back to what messenger RNA is. Messenger RNA is a copy of the DNA. So every person, every animal has their own specific DNA. It's formed at the time of conception. It's in that initial fertilized egg. And every time the cell reproduces, the DNA reproduces, and you have an exact copy in the new cell. So virtually every cell in your body has the DNA code within it for you, for the specific proteins to recreate you. And in a human, it's like 100,000 proteins that the DNA codes for. And so that sits in the nucleus of the cell. The DNA is tightly wound up. It sits in the nucleus of the cell because you normally don't need all of those 100,000 proteins to be produced all at the same time. So depending on the cell type, depending on the situation, a certain area of the DNA needs to be read and needs to produce that specific protein. And so the DNA is held in the nucleus, kind of like the library vault. Okay, it's there protected. The DNA doesn't make the protein. What happens? The DNA, when your cell, in a specific cell, decides that it needs a certain protein, which is exceedingly complicated, right? This is an amazing machine. The human body or the mammalian body is an amazing machine. Then that specific section of the tightly coiled DNA unwinds a little bit, and that part of the DNA is read and a copy is made. The copy that's made is RNA. Okay, it's not a DNA copy, it's an RNA copy, and that's messenger RNA. And so it reads that specific code for that specific protein that needs to be made, and then the messenger RNA moves out of the nucleus of the cell into the cytoplasm of the cell, where the protein synthesis factory is, all the different enzymes that then read the messenger RNA code to make that specific protein. It's read there in the cytoplasm, and that protein is produced. It might be insulin, it might be myoglobin or hemoglobin, depending, one of your 100,000 possible proteins is then made. So that's how that works. So messenger RNA in the nucleus, it's made up of individual messenger RNA bases. They're kind of like individual letters that are arranged in a specific sequence according to the DNA. And so as the messenger RNA is being formed, those letters are picked out and arranged in a very specific order according to the DNA, and then that moves out, and then that is read through in the process of protein synthesis to produce that new protein. And after that happens, very quickly after that happens, the messenger RNA breaks up again into those individual letters, those individual RNA bases, to be picked up again and rearranged to make the next type of protein. Okay, so that's how that works. So an RNA vaccine, a messenger RNA vaccine, is what happens is that we are able to then to read the DNA on the pathogen, say COVID-19, for example, right? We're able to read that. And then from that DNA, we make messenger RNA, or messenger RNA is made for the specific surface proteins of the virus. Okay. And then rather than injecting the protein into the body, or rather than using the virus, the killed virus or the live virus to inject that into the body, the messenger RNA alone is injected into the body. Okay. That messenger RNA codes for that foreign intruder protein. And so it goes into the cytoplasm of the cell, the factory for protein synthesis, and produces that foreign protein. Your own body produces that foreign protein. And then once that happens, the messenger RNA is broken up into those individual bases to be used again. Okay, so you're left then with that foreign intruder protein. All of a sudden, in the middle of your cells, you have this foreign intruder protein. Your immune system says, hey, that's not me, that's not self, we need to attack it. It creates an immune response against that. So if ever in the future you're exposed to that specific protein, the surface protein for that virus, say, then the immune system is able to fight it. So theoretically, it's a great tool because we can rapidly read, if a new epidemic breaks out, we can rapidly read the DNA and then make the messenger RNA to then inject and protect. The problem is that the messenger RNA breaks down really quickly. Okay, so theoretically, it's wonderful. It's like, hey, I don't have to inject a foreign substance. I don't have to inject a live virus. I don't have to inject even dead virus, which there's, potential vaccine reaction complications to all of that. I simply need to give messenger RNA, which every cell already has. It's identical, basically, except for the arrangement of the letters into the cell. The cell produces the protein. All of a sudden, the protein's there. Immune response against the protein, and now you have immunity against that specific viral pathogen. But the problem, so the devil's always in the details, right? Theoretically, it's great, but the messenger RNA breaks down so quickly that they have to, find methods to keep it from breaking down so quickly. So they might alter the nucleotides a little bit, or they might encase the messenger RNA in a lipid, a fatty, a coating so that it's absorbed and not broken down so quickly. And so there's been reactions to that type of thing, right? So in theory, it's great. It's another tool in the toolbox for an epidemic. We can rapidly produce a vaccine that can be effective. You don't have to have cell cultures. It doesn't take years and years of research and development to find an effective vaccine. So there's a lot of positives, but there's also some negatives. Okay. So one of the negatives is that messenger RNA is so labile, it's so easily broken down that it has to be stored in liquid nitrogen, which, 196 degrees Celsius below zero, right? Very, very cold situations. It has to be, once it's reconstituted, it has to be rapidly used. So far, it seems that these messenger RNA vaccines have been very inflammatory. I don't know if we totally understand why that is, but it creates a lot of inflammation. Maybe it's the change in the messenger RNA, but so inflammation can occur, including in the myocardium, the heart muscle, to produce myocarditis, and all of a sudden, you have these severe reactions, sometimes deaths from that. So there needs to be more research done. But in theory, it's a very powerful tool. There are still diseases that we don't have vaccines for. We haven't been able to produce effective vaccines. Common cold, right, be one of them. But also like in livestock, foot and mouth disease, African swine fever. There's a number of diseases that are very, very, would be devastating to the livestock industry. If they were ever introduced into our country, and we don't have vaccines for them. So it provides another tool in the toolbox, but some of these things still need to be worked out.
Okay. The vaccine conversation is such an interesting one because people have varied opinions and evolving opinions on them. And I will say mine has evolved over the years significantly. But one thing I think that's well, first of all, there's no mRNA vaccines currently being used in the United States, from my understanding, for animals. Is that correct?
Well, there's none used for cattle, sheep, or goats, or any species, except there is one that's approved for pigs.
Okay, that's what I was going to say.
There's a Merck vaccine. Pardon?
Sequevity, or is that what it is?
Yes, Sequevity, exactly. So that's an RNA vaccine, a little different from like the COVID type vaccine, but it's very similar. That is a messenger RNA vaccine that's approved for prescription only for pigs, kind of in anticipation of viral outbreaks that can happen in swine populations, specifically for like swine influenza, but also porcine endemic diarrhea, picovirus, a rotavirus. So there's a few different viral diseases that could really be devastating. So this vaccine has been approved for use on a prescription only basis in pigs. That's the only messenger RNA vaccine that's available.
Do you know what the withdrawal time has been given for that?
I'm not sure. There's withdrawal times for all vaccines, all vaccinations in livestock. Generally, it's like 21 days.
Okay.
For that one, I'm not sure. It would be at least 21 days.
Okay. So I think that's
perhaps longer.
That's the biggest concern, I think, for people is the fact that this could be getting into the food supply. And I'm not really sure. I know how mRNA vaccines work. I understand it. But even thinking through that, I'm not entirely sure whether I feel that it could get into the meat or not. I can't really translate that. I'm still considering that. But one thing I do know is that for humans, when it came to the COVID vaccine, there's been studies published saying that like Moderna, the spike protein was still detected in individuals up to 28 days after vaccination. So I think that's where the concern is with the withdrawal time specifically, that could somehow still be existing and we could be ingesting it.
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's a valid concern. And again, the devil's in the details. So these things would have to be really studied and to make sure that there isn't any untoward effects. But also, remember that these aren't like live viral, products. There's no virus potentially being transmitted. These are even, spike protein. It's a protein. But, during digestion, proteins are chains of amino acids. We don't absorb the the proteins whole. Our bodies break them up, digest them into the individual amino acids that are then absorbed. So
that's where I'm like, I don't know that ingesting it, we could be taking it in. That's where I'm like, you're not injecting this into yourself. You're ingesting meat that's been cooked.
Exactly.
In most situations.
Yes, that's good.
Where, but I still don't think it's a good idea just to start doing this. I want to be clear on that. But it's hard to get the truth anymore. Like you have people, Cecily and I were just talking about this before coming on. You have people that, like, I am very skeptical And I don't trust the FDA or the USDA to do the research for me. I just don't trust those organizations. They don't have the same belief systems as me, and they don't look at health in the same ways I do. I don't just blanket trust what they say to be true. But I also am not going to jump off the deep end and just like declare something completely unsafe without thinking it through. So this is why I wanted to have this conversation, because I want people to be able to figure it out for themselves, kind of what they think.
Yeah. Right. No, I think that's wise. So it's like a lot of these other things, initially it's like, okay, how is that going to affect things? And I think those are valid questions and concerns that we should have. And those things really do need to be extensively tested out before we have an answer. Like I said, with the COVID vaccine, we didn't expect this inflammatory response. They didn't expect that. It's something that they really didn't foresee. So the body's very, very complex. And so, we need to have a full understanding of it. At the same time, there are a lot of potential advantages to being able to use it. And so if it can be a safe means, an alternative tool in the toolbox for vaccination, then that would really be great and maybe be very, very helpful in the case of, say, a foot and mouth outbreak or something like that. Also, it's important to remember, too, that the livestock industry has a very vested interest in this as well, right? Because they depend on public trust of their product. And so, they don't want to go anywhere near something that people are going to say, I'm not going to eat meat because maybe it has this. So they are, also very wary, have a very vested interest to make sure and promote things that really are safe. And I think that's, comes down to like the country of origin labeling, right? Where we in the United States have a specific protocol that has to be followed in order for food to come to the table, and other countries don't have that system. And when their products come into our, come into our consumers, the consumer should be able to know that. They should be aware of, hey, this came from Argentina, and it's it's maybe treated differently than meat or plant material grown here. Maybe different pesticides, maybe different withdrawal times, maybe different vaccinations, right? So I think that's very important for the consumer to be aware of, hey, what am I getting here, right? For that to be open to them.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that every person we've talked to, so far has kind of driven home. The farmer will do what the consumer wants. And so consumers just need to tell the farmers what they want and what they value. So one more thing on the mRNA, I was looking up the other day, University of Pennsylvania has devoted a whole research project to the mRNA vaccines and developing them for livestock. And one thing that I found was interesting is they talked about how they're trying to leverage this expertise to figure out how to get the immunity to stay around longer, because mRNA vaccines are really bad at developing long-term immunity and T cell immunity. So I just found that to be an interesting point, especially when related back to things that happened over the last several years. These things are very complicated, right? And so with COVID outbreak, that was kind of rushed out, right? But obviously needs to be a lot more work to figure this out. What's the best presentation of the mRNA to be the most effective? Can it be more effective, or maybe does it have a place maybe in an initial outbreak, but then later on other vaccines can come around to supplement it? Just a lot of questions. The human body is exceedingly complicated, and it is.
What you see initially at face value might not hold true, right? So it's complicated and somewhat not complicated at the same time, like depending on how you look at things. I don't know. It's a brilliant system. You think of DNA, which is the most dense information system known to man, by far exceeding the most complicated mainframe computer. How it stores information. I mean, it's a massive storage vault in a molecular space. Wow. It's truly fearfully and wonderfully made. Yeah.
Yeah. When people question miracles, right? It's like, I don't believe miracles could happen. It's like, well, we're all standing here somehow. Somehow all of this exists. Yes. And that is the biggest miracle of all, right?
Yeah.
It's very complex and amazing. Yeah.
My son is wearing a shirt with that verse on it today, actually. It was sent to me when he was born, and I just forgot he had that on. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Very true.
Do you have any other questions, Cecily? I don't know. This was good. I just appreciate being able to hash that out. So
I do appreciate that. And I think for a lot of our listeners, the vaccine conversation is potentially one-sided a lot of the time, especially, because people tend to be polarized on it. So whether they've heard one side or the other side, and I appreciate that you laid it out very clearly what it all is and just kind of left it for people to be like, now I know a little bit about it and I can pursue some information. But I also like it that you brought it back to mandatory country of origin labeling, because that's something we talked about a lot with Bill as well. So it's very good. Yeah. Anything else, Rita?
Nope. Do you want to just tell people where they can find you? I know you are rolling out for ranchers. I know that we'll have farmers listening to this and you're rolling out a program for them. So tell people where they can find you if they're interested in touching base and learning about your ranch management program.
Yeah. So the program is called Ranch Vision, and it's at ranchvision.io, ranchvision.io. And you can learn more about the program there. It's an interactive computer program. It's a forward-looking management program, unlike really any other type of livestock management program. In the past, those were all backward-looking record-keeping type programs. But this is an interactive forward-looking program enabling you to see months and years ahead of time the results of your management decisions, and then to change those and to manipulate those to manage towards maximal ranch profitability. So that's the program. It's called Ranch Vision, which is kind of explains it. You can see forward, you can see what you're doing, you can manipulate things, and then you can make rational decisions to make the most of what you got. So, yeah.
Smart.
Ranchvision.io.
I'll make sure we get that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think my daughter's put together an Instagram page, and it's Dr. Brazil DVM. Dr. Brazil DVM. That
awesome.
Kind of tells more about that.
Yeah. And I really like the videos that you guys are putting on there. So people should definitely check that out.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I have some great kids. And so, yeah, they're like, Dad, you got to stand here and, record this. And so, yeah.
That's great. I love it.
Crack me up when I talk to you on the phone and I told you, I have a 13-year-old and a 1-year-old. You're like, wow, that's a spread. And then you proceeded to tell me how many kids you have. I was like, how are you surprised by this? That was great.
No.
That's great.
Love it.
Well, yeah, kids are, we were overwhelmed with the first one and, but nothing harder, nothing better. So,
yeah, that's so true.
Yep.
Very good. Well, thank you for sharing your time with us. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's great to talk to both of you.
Okay, that was 2 great interviews from 2 great men that I really enjoyed talking with, learning from, and just gathering their perspective on these important topics. And so I really hope you guys are enjoying this as much as we are. But at the beginning of this episode, we had let you know that we were going to read, I'd say about half, maybe 3/4 of Bill's editorial in response to Drover's article called mRNA Conspiracy Theories, Ranch Group Offers Fear-Mongering and Misinformation. So basically, Rita, what's happening is they are researching this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's happening. And obviously, if that research is happening, it's happening for a purpose, right? And so that's very much what Bill is touching on here. But I'm going to start here near the bottom of page 1 from when I printed it anyway. Drovers even took exception to RCAF USA's use of the term mRNA injection rather than mRNA vaccine. There was a good reason for this. According to research by Robert Thornsberry, DVM, contemporary vaccines typically use the same germs that cause disease, but in a killed or weakened state so they don't make the patient sick. An mRNA injection is different because it contains a synthetically produced genetic code that tricks living cells into manufacturing a protein-based germ antigen itself. Dr. Thornsberry indicates mRNA injections belong in the category of gene therapy, experimental techniques that use genes to treat disease. Drovers also criticized RCAF USA's statement that mRNA injections hijack living cells, but that is exactly what they do. Living cells are factories that produce more living cells, but when injected with mRNA, the factory retools and begins producing antigens pursuant to the coded instructions delivered to it by the synthetically produced mRNA injection. Drovers then brought in an associate professor of animal science at Texas A&M, Dr. Penny Riggs, to refute RCAF USA's points of concerns regarding mRNA injections. Riggs was quoted making the following definitive assertions. She said, "No food safety risk exists for meat from animals that have received any vaccination." She also said, "mRNA from a vaccine will not be passed along in meat." But research by Dr. Thornsberry includes findings that render Riggs' definitive findings at least uncertain, if not false. They cite examples here. I cannot say where this is cited from because it's, Fertig or something. Found lipid nanoparticles with mRNA, and they were measurable in plasma for 15 days. Recently, another study demonstrated mRNA in blood out to 28 days, and another have found mRNA in lymph nodes 60 days after injection. All of these studies will be linked in this article, which will be linked in our show notes. And then again, as recently as January 31st, 2022, researchers have published techniques for mRNA administration through the human stomach. A recent review paper written by Helene Banoun, a pharmacist biologist from France, raises alarms about the shedding of COVID-19 coded mRNA from vaccinated to unvaccinated close associates. Banoun is quoted as saying, "Vaccine mRNA carrying lipid nanoparticles spread after injection throughout the body, according to available animal studies in vaccine mRNA, and it is found in the bloodstream." Based on her findings, Banoun stated, "It is urgent to enforce the legislation on gene therapy that applies to mRNA vaccines and to carry out studies on this subject, while the generalization of mRNA vaccines is being considered." Swedish researchers published in Current Issues Molecular Biology 2022, their findings that directly dispute the claim that mRNA injections do not enter the nucleus of the cell where our DNA, which is genetic material, is located. While their study was performed utilizing liver cancer cells in culture, within 6 hours of exposing the liver cells to COVID-19 spike antigen-coded mRNA, reverse transcription occurred, placing the mRNA-carried genetic code into the nuclear DNA of the cells. With so many unknowns, just how should a responsible ranch group respond amidst this ongoing battle between scientific experts regarding the short and long-term safety of mRNA injections for cattle? Should we simply trust the pharmaceutical companies and the government, as Riggs suggests, when she advised that we should be celebrating the advances in technology that enable more precise and effective strategies for ensuring animal health and well-being in order to continue producing the nutritious and safe meat, milk, and other animal source products that sustain life and good health? RCAF USA disagrees. Instead, we intend to learn the truth by continuing to disclose differing scientific findings, seeking more research into the long-term effects of mRNA injections for cattle, and demanding more transparency from pharmaceutical companies and the government. Meanwhile, Congress should immediately enact the American Beef Labeling Act, so consumers can begin distinguishing beef produced exclusively in the United States, where mRNA is not approved for cattle, from imported beef that may be subjected to mRNA's injections. So very good. And when is transparency ever a bad thing, Yeah. So
the two main things there I take away is, with so many unknowns, how should a responsible ranch group respond? Mm-hmm. And we intend to learn the truth by continuing to disclose different scientific findings. I mean, what's wrong with that?
Nothing.
Doesn't line the pockets of anyone, I guess. But
yeah, maybe that's what it is. Well, anyway, you guys, this was episode 2 in our 5-part series on food supply, and we hope it got you thinking more about your food, the safety and quality of your food, and the stewardship of how it is produced and grown. So don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss anything else from this series and all the other great series that we have coming up. Please leave a 5-star review if you enjoy the content and feel like you're learning from it. And don't forget to check out the links in our show notes to find out where you can connect with us outside of the podcast. Thanks for listening.